Thank you, Chair, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be speaking to my native city. I spoke in the earlier session in my native language, so allow me to do this presentation in English right now. Although, of course, if questions pop up in Greek, it's going to be in Greek. Before I start, could you tell me, Chair, how much time do I have? And just
I would say 15 minutes.
And 5 minutes before, just signal so at least I will have the time to go into a slide. What I opted to do, because I've seen the long title under my name, I'm Director in the Directorate of Strategy, Simplification and Policy Analysis, to give a little bit of justification to all these three terms. So we'll look at the big picture. And the big picture will not necessarily be a picture related only to the livestock sector, although we'll draw very concrete examples in what I will present from the livestock sector. But I think the first thing we have to ask ourselves is whether we are in front of a major transformation that is taking place in the agro-food system worldwide, and what are the elements, what are the characteristics of this transformation. And everybody, everywhere you go, you see a lot of signals and indications that this is really happening. And what characterizes the current system is that we're moving from a phase where we solved economic and social problems with a very significant increase in food productivity, and with the fact that we made food affordable to wider masses of the world population at the expense of the environment, whether this was soil, air, water, and biodiversity. We're moving now towards a phase of simultaneously solving, or at least having the capacity to solve, economic and environmental problems, call it precision farming, or 4.0 also, but potentially with increasing social tensions, whether it is on health, whether it's on the knowledge gaps, on the digital divide, the gaps in urban and rural jobs and growth, what have you. The first phase was not characterized farming 3.0. It was called the Green Revolution, and it might have taken over a generation to realize environmental costs, although even that is not only negative. For example, the increase in productivity had as a result that a significant part of land that would have otherwise used for agriculture was not used for agriculture, and would like to hope that it was used for good purposes as a carbon sink. And there is always oversimplification in trying to generalize overall trends. But let's go a little bit into the details, because these are going to be aspects of what will come in the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy. Yesterday, I was at a breakfast in the European Parliament, where even the question popped up, how do we define sustainability? Well, we are in a mature 21st century. Do we need to ask this question? Sustainability has three very concrete elements. It has an element of an economic, an element of an environmental, and an element of social dimensions. So what do we know about this? First of all, food and farming 4.0, because it applies also in the food sector, is based on the use of digital technologies, which is what is used throughout the economy, and big data in practices throughout the food chain. The potential to increase environmental, economic efficiency and environmental efficiency is not a theoretical one. Whether you talk about arable crops, where roughly speaking we see increases in the range of 10 to 15% in productivity, declines in the range of 15 to 20% in chemical use, and an increase in biodiversity. Whether you talk about your sector, where increases in the efficiency of feeds have very significant results in reduction of emissions, especially methane emissions. Whether we talk about permanent crops, where the most targeted use of pesticides reduces significantly the cost, this is more than a potential. It's a reality. But this reality comes with these three very significant gaps. Not everybody is privy to the knowledge that goes with these technologies. The transfer of these technologies is not done in a manner that allows more farmers and more producers to use it. The fact that farm advisory systems in most parts of the world, including in my own country, are nowhere where they used to be 20 or 30 years ago, and have moved more into bureaucracies that are actually linking knowledge with what people apply on the ground, shows the significant gap. But more than anything, and I mentioned it in the earlier session, so I will not come to it, it's the issue of the perceptions. And I talk about perceptions because we have a big problem with big data. It is one thing to talk about the privacy of individual economic data. And the New York Times article that makes headlines about where the subsidies goes has a very inaccurate information. We never provided to the World Bank or anybody individual data. We provide data at the aggregate level, at NUTS 3 level of the case, because we believe that the economic data should become individual and be protected. But data on land use, data on soil, on air, on water, on biodiversity, these are not and should not be private data. And we have to find ways of linking the information that they provide us to better designing policies in the future. Changes also characterize food demand. What I said before is the supply side. Now on the demand side, this is driven by mixed shifts in taste and preferences. When we talk about demand, usually we talk about a price and quantity relationship, forgetting that we derive the demand curves on the basis of taste and preferences. Population, income, and consumption trends differ worldwide. Not everybody belongs to the most educated strata and the most affluent strata of the European Union or the west and east coast of the United States. There are still very significant parts of world population that base their choices and decisions by necessity, if you want, on prices, and not on many of the things that we have been debating. What does this imply for a sector like yours? It implies that you see a demand curve that is shifting right and left crazily within the span of a few years, and this is a sector that needs many years to adjust. Developed, emerging, and developing world dietary patterns differ significantly. Everybody keeps talking about beef in the developed world, but beef consumption in the developed world has been going down year after year, whether it's in the European Union, in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand. It only suffices to look at the statistics, which, by the way, most people never do before they come up with their conclusions. Where it's growing in the developing countries. And it's growing because the developing countries need more protein coming from red meat, based exactly on scientific advice that comes from the same organizations that others use to say how, by eating less beef, we will save the planet. And a very significant increase in consumption is coming from pork and for poultry. In fact, a back of the envelope calculation indicates that the additional feed demand for poultry in the next 10 years will exceed by far the additional feed demand that will go into the beef sector for the same products. So this very diverse situation generates expectations for solutions that do not always match a fact-based analysis and approach. And for me, this is the most crucial dilemma that we're going to face when we discuss about the Green Deal. We want, and we have the right ambition to turn this continent into a net neutral in terms of emissions by 2050. This does not imply that we have to do certain things in the livestock sector. It implies that we have to do many things in all the sectors, including livestock. And there are going to be sectors that will always emit. Agriculture is a typical one. But when we talk about agriculture, we forget we're talking about one of the basic human needs, food. If you add to that shelter, clothing, energy, and transport, every single one of them has to contribute. And we have to make sure that when we go in this direction, the baseline on the basis of which we will judge our ambition has to be based on evidence and not on some slogan that somebody is going to throw on a tweet, and because on a tweet the slogans always have the upper hand, will tend to dominate the policy debate. Finally, in the farm to fork strategy, there is a farm, there is a fork, and more developments are driven by the fork side, by the demand side, but there is a two-part. And the two-part is trade in the broader sense, both within the EU or within member states and across the globe. It's the exchange of what farmers produce and what consumers consume. Here we have very significant increases in price volatility, although they're often driven by exogenous factors, macro, geopolitical. I'm not going to enter into that because of lack of time. It is important to highlight the differences in cost, but sometimes these differences in costs are driven by different production standards, which are not necessarily linked to trade, labor standards, for example, the wage rate. But bring that to the forefront something that the minister also mentioned in the morning. When you do and negotiate trade agreements, there is no argument to be made by trying to say that trade doesn't generate more welfare. It does generate more welfare, and we have to see what happens when the world economy slows down, trade slows down, and everybody pays the price. But trade generates winners and losers, and there have to be mechanisms whereby the winners compensate the losers. The European Union is the best example of trade liberalization with the single market. That has a common agricultural policy, the regional funds, an EU research policy, social funds, exactly to compensate those that are left behind. So, the role of the farm-to-fork strategy in the Green Deal, to summarize, food is not just a supply-driven challenge, but increasingly one reflecting competing and contradictory shifts in consumer and citizen concerns. Climate and environment issues are bound to dominate the farm policy debate, and that's a good thing. The bad thing is that they dominate the policy debate without evidence supporting arguments on one and the other side, and there are significant trade-offs in the search of solutions. All choices must increase the level of ambition, and not only some sectors. I don't know how much time is left because we have a graph that we're working in. I'm not going to leave you this graph, not because there is anything secret, but it's work in progress. But what we're trying to do is identify the key drivers in the farm, in the two and the fork part of there. And what I put here, and that's what I will only focus on in one more minute, is the areas that you asked me, and it's the title of the panel, about labor shortages and how it's addressed. So in terms of innovation and digitalization, the farming sector has the interesting situation where the demographics are such that we lose farmers every year, and we will continue to lose farmers every year around the world because of the change in the population dynamics. But new technologies generate the need for new type of jobs that are more knowledge-based, better for the younger generation, and better for the link of the farming sector to services. So that's a positive development in terms of labor. Macro and trade tensions do exactly the opposite. They generate the tendency in some areas to lose jobs. The development of many forms of short food supply chains, which I've put somewhere in the middle, also generates more job opportunities, and also at the local level, and that's extremely interesting. The segmentation of the food market gives mixed signals. In some parts, you lose a lot of jobs, but it generates in other areas more job possibilities. The changes in the retail demand are very interesting because retail is a typical area where new technologies generate net job losses, which is not the case in the food chain. Finally, in the prospects for rural areas, which is one of the areas where the new Commission will focus in with a new Vice President of the Commission focusing on developing growth in rural areas. The dynamic of rural areas are not necessarily the dynamics of the farming sector in rural areas. We see more and more that the health of the overall economy is one that determines the health of rural areas. But it is extremely important to see what type of infrastructure measures are needed that will make rural areas attractive to a younger generation, because it's nice to talk about farming 4.0, but the problem of farming 4.0 is not that farmers don't have a smartphone and they cannot take a picture of a leaf that will have a disease. The problem is, do we have internet connection in rural areas that would allow farmers that want to do it to do it? So that's for the moment, and thank you very much for your attention.